decisions rewrite the sign for which you have been accepted to the... Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness!
Danielle, you gotta see this. Look at this.
Come here, come here, come here.
Okay.
How have you not seen that yet?
Congratulations. Thank you. Start from the beginning. Tell us everything. Okay, so
I can't believe it.
What is it?
You gotta be kidding me. That's great. Hey, come here. You gotta listen to the story.
I have something to show you.
Oh my goodness! Dad! Dad!
That is great.
We're getting this tonight.
Who are we gonna tell first?
We gotta tell our moms. Your mom and my mom.
Well, hey, welcome. How you guys doing? That was fantastic. Me too. My name's John, and as Scott just said, we are in the series finale of the series we've been in for a number of weeks now. Good News is for Sharing, and that means next weekend is going to be a little different. So next weekend, I'm actually very excited about this. It's Thanksgiving weekend, and we've been planning this now for a while. A really special weekend, including celebrating communion together, which will be, I think, a perfect way to just cap off your Thanksgiving season, your Thanksgiving holiday. And so that's next weekend. And then the very following weekend, the first weekend of December, and I know it's hard to imagine, like this is upon us, my friends. As Scott said, we're beginning this new series, Reasons for the Season. And with Christmas right around the corner, you are soon going to be seeing the bumper stickers and the clings and the posts that say, Jesus is the reason for the season, right? And it's true. And as far as that goes, like if there had never been a Jesus, there would be no Christmas. Like, so that's pretty true. But if Jesus was right, and I'm inclined to think he was, and his first followers were right, then that's not the whole story. In fact, if Jesus was right, in a real sense, we are actually the reasons for the season. Because if we had not been such a mess, there would not have been a need for Christmas, if you're following me. And so on this first weekend of December, I want to invite you to bring your messy self and all your messy friends, your neighbors, your relatives, your in-laws, and invite them all. This is really going to be a perfect series to get into the real meaning behind this season that we celebrate year after year. And as Scott said, we're kicking off on a Saturday night, the first Saturday night of December, with this Sing a Song of Christmas, which if you got kids, I mean, that's going to be a perfect one to invite some friends and family to. But this series, I believe, is going to help you and maybe some people in your life discover the deeper meaning behind the story of Christmas. And I'm excited for that. But today, we're wrapping up this series, Good News is for Sharing. And as many times as I've seen that video that we lead into the message with, it just captures me every time that it really is human nature when you experience something good, when you have something good going on in your life, that you just want to share that with other people, which, by the way, is exactly how the Jesus movement began, with people experiencing something so amazing, so good, so wonderful, so life-changing, mind-changing, that they just had to tell other people. And so we've been basing this series, we've been going back to some of their stories found in a document known as the Acts of the Apostles, or sometimes just called Acts, or the Book of Acts for short, to see if there are lessons that we can learn from their stories of how they shared good news that will help us propel the good news of the Jesus movement into our generation and the next generation. This history of the early Jesus movement, written by a doctor and historian named Luke. Now, Luke was not an original follower of Jesus. He was not one of the OG G's. But in this document, he traces the expansion of this movement from, in Jesus' own words, from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and eventually to the ends of the earth. And the first half of his history, he focuses on those very first followers of Jesus, those who had been immediate like disciples of Jesus himself and how they told the story and how they shared that good news. And in the second half of his history, he turns his attention to a man named Saul of Tarsus, who becomes way better known by his Roman name, Paul, or Paul the Apostle, as he begins to travel the Mediterranean region, planting or starting, if you will, these Jesus communities everywhere he goes. And in fact, Luke, who's the author of this history, was actually a part of some of his travels, an eyewitness to some of the things he documents. And sometimes in some of these cities, Paul would spend maybe a year or more, up to 2.5, maybe 3 years in one city. Sometimes he would be attacked and chased out of a city within just a few weeks. But as he would move on, and he would always move on, eventually he would write letters back to these church communities that he had started or helped to start. And those letters end up becoming documents in what we call the New Testament. And so we ended up last week with Paul in chains, about to be sent to Rome, where he was going to stand trial before Caesar, who was Nero at the time, where he would stay in chains in house arrest for 2 more years after being in prison for 2 years already. And it was there in chains, awaiting trial, that he writes a number of letters, one of which was a letter to the Christians or the Jesus community in the ancient city of Colossae, which is located right here. Colossae was part of this tri-city area in eastern Turkey, modern eastern Turkey, then the Roman province of Asia. And the Jesus community there had been planted or started when Paul had spent a number of years in his third journey in this city right here, the city of Ephesus, where we just kind of glossed over that story last week. And as he's in Ephesus, a friend of his, a coworker named Epaphras, who is from Colossae, takes the good news back there. And this Jesus movement is started, or this Jesus community is started, this church is started in Colossae. Well, a number of years later, now Paul is in Rome, and Epaphras travels to Rome to visit Paul, bring us some news, the good and bad, how things are going back home. And Paul writes them this letter back, just encouraging them to stay focused. Now, towards the end of his letter, that he writes something about their influence in their community that we just thought would be a perfect way to wrap up this series that we've been in. The end of his letter, beginning in Colossians, we would call it chapter 4. He didn't write chapters or verses. He just wrote a letter like you would write a letter, and then we break it up like this. So Colossians, what we would call Colossians 4, here's how he ends his letter. Here's how this goes. He says, pray diligently, or like be constant, or steadfast is how this term, he's writing in Greek, we translate it into English, sometimes translated steadfastly, but that's kind of like a word people don't use anymore. It's also a thing people don't really do anymore because it implies like resilience and stick-to-itiveness, which is kind of a bygone trait in many cases. But like this idea of just resilience or diligence, unfaltering in prayer. And then he adds 2 descriptors to this kind of prayer he's talking about. He says, being watchful, alert, like head on a swivel, paying attention, and being grateful. Now, you think about that, this is a different kind of prayer than maybe many of us pray most times, right? Because most of our prayers, or some of our prayers, kind of go like this. Dear God, thank you for this day. Nothing wrong with that. Dear God, thank you for this day. Bless me, please bless, or help me, or help my friend, or help them. And we pray for things like safety and safe travels. We pray for jobs and illness and pets and tests, and there's nothing wrong with any of that. But he's talking about a different kind of prayer here. He's talking about constant, non-stop, alert, mindful, grateful prayer. It's the picture, really, of a person who's walking through their day or walking through the world in constant connection with God, in constant awareness of the people around them and the situations around them, and in constant gratitude, like really paying attention to the people in the world and the circumstances around them, while at the same time carrying on this conversational relationship with God about it all. In other words, not so lost in the clouds that they're not paying attention to what's in front of them, and not so lost in the weeds and what's in front of them, the here and now, that they've lost sight of what God might actually be doing in the world around them, what he might want to be up to. And that's the kind of prayer he's talking about. Pray, and pray diligently and watchfully and gratefully, which raises a question, like, why? Why do we need to pray this way? In fact, I think part of what we struggle with about prayer, what many people struggle with, and maybe you at times might struggle with, is just understanding why we pray at all. And especially, why would we have to pray constantly or repeatedly or resiliently? And it's really important in understanding how Paul ends this letter to understand something that's very basic about responsibility and in our influence or responsibility or our causality, if you will. In fact, philosopher Dallas Willard, who's actually quoting or referencing something that another great thinker, C.S. Lewis, once wrote, says that you and I interact with our circumstances or act upon our environment and our world in two different ways, two different kinds of causation, if you will, two different ways of causing an effect. That's how to think about that. And on the one hand, Willard says, we influence our physical surroundings with our actions and our words. So he gives this example. He says, so if you have a flower bed that's overgrown with weeds, you could pray about it. You could pray that the weeds would die or that God would just get rid of them all. You could do that, but your weeds and your flower bed actually fall within your sphere of influence and responsibility, what Willard refers to as your domain. That's your world. And so as much as you might pray about this, you'd probably better take some action, right? You better roll up your sleeves and go out on your flower bed or make your kids do it. Hello. I mean, but there's a way of acting on our environment. And this is kind of an amazing idea when you roll this out, because when you think about it, God has seen to it that you are actually very powerful as an agent of cause in the world, probably a lot more powerful than you think you are or give yourself credit for. See, everything you do and everything you say actually matters in the world. There's a saying in a field known as chaos theory. You've probably heard this before, that if a butterfly flaps its wings in one part of the world, it can set in motion a chain of events that results in a hurricane somewhere else in the world, right? You've heard of that? It was actually during the 1960s when Edward Lorenz, who was a meteorologist at MIT, he was working on this project to simulate weather patterns on a computer, and he discovered that infinitesimally small changes of inputs in the simulations caused enormous changes in the results. And the discovery became known as, anyone know it? The butterfly effect. Yeah, the butterfly effect. And here's the butterfly effect. Very small changes in the initial conditions of a complex physical system can lead to very large changes in the system's subsequent behavior. Little things can actually ripple into the world and make a big difference. And the same is actually true of you. The same is true of every single one of us in this big, complex system that we live in. Everything we do or don't do, everything we say actually matters. God has given you incredible power and influence in the world as someone who is created in his own image to reflect that in the world. But there are certain things that do not fall within your sphere of direct influence or causality. And so Willard gives this example. He says, so if your flower bed is full of weeds, you can pray, but you probably better go weed your flower bed. On the other hand, he says, if your friend is addicted to heroin, whatever else you think you might be able to do or say to help them, you'd better pray, because you cannot just fix them. You can't fix them like you can fix your flower bed with your actions or your words. And he writes, and this is so true, it's actually good that you can't. It's good that they aren't within your direct sphere of power and control like that. They are, in some sense, beyond you. And the changes they need to make are beyond you and outside of your direct sphere. But he says, but there is another kind of causation, that we influence the spiritual world around us through prayer. We influence the physical surroundings just by the things we do and the things we say, but we influence the spiritual environment or surroundings with prayer. And in prayer, it's like we enter into and influence the spiritual environment that surrounds us, because we are not just physical beings, we are spiritual beings as well. And just as throwing a rock into the middle of the pond causes ripples, or pulling the weeds out of your flower bed, we become causes. In prayer, we become agents of cause, if you will, in the spiritual world, agents of cause and effect. And just as God has seen to it, that you and I are powerful and effective agents of cause in the physical world. And just as it is true that if you don't pull the weeds in your flower bed, they probably are going to stay there, so too, this is something huge to think about, God has seen to it that you and I are powerful agents of cause in the spiritual world as well. In fact, Jesus' brother James once wrote this mind-boggling little statement in a letter. He writes, "You do not have because you do not ask God." Think about that statement for a second. In other words, there are certain things that God would do that he doesn't do because you didn't ask. That's crazy, right? There are certain expressions of God's power that are not exerted without prayer. There are certain effects in this world that are not caused without prayer. There are things that we can do in our physical world through direct cause and effect, and then there's the spiritual world. Now, the truth is, most of the challenges we face involve both, right? Intersections between the things that we can do and therefore must do, that there are things we can do and we must do them because they fall within our sphere of responsibility and influence and our domain, if you will. And then at the same time, in most situations, there are also things we cannot simply do. We cannot simply do by our direct causation, and so we must pray. And Jesus actually taught his followers constantly to do both. He taught us to be revolutionaries in our physical environment, to work hard, to do so much good, to love like nobody had ever seen before, to patch up the wounded and heal the sick and feed the hungry. But Jesus knew, and we know, life is not merely a matter of the physical things that you can change and how you can change the world through your own influence. There are spiritual components and societal components and systemic components that are beyond us all. So whatever else we can and will and maybe should do to change the world, to influence the world around us, to share good news with the world around us, we had better pray. So as Paul closes his letter, he's just tapping into that and he's saying, hey, you guys pray, and pray constantly and steadfastly, pray watchfully, pray gratefully, and then I think kind of modeling, if you will, the kind of prayer he's talking about, he requests prayer for himself. And he says at the same time, like while you're praying this way constantly and watchfully and gratefully, at the same time, pray for us. And he's about to he's about to write a prayer request, if you will, but again, it is not the kind of thing that you and I would be like writing on our prayer requests at all. I mean, imagine this. He's in chains, and he's been in chains for years, at least 2.5, I would say maybe 3+ years by this point. He's from Caesarea to Rome, this crazy shipwreck. He's been in chains for years, and he's awaiting trial before Caesar. So let me ask you, what would be on your prayer request? So Scott was like, hey, fill out the Connect card and like let us know how you're doing, how we can pray for you. What would you write on this card? If you were in chains in Rome waiting for trial before Caesar, I mean, it would be like, hello, freedom, to get out of here. Yes, justice. How about some justice in this world? Maybe pray for me that God would give me favor with Caesar, that he would like me and look favorably upon me. Or how about this one? That I pray that I could just understand why. Just understand why this has happened to me and why it keeps happening to me. What would you write on your prayer request? Well, here's what Paul writes on his prayer request. Pray for us too while you pray, like constantly, diligently, watchfully. Pray that God might open a door for our message. Hello, I'm like, how about just he would open a door? Like he would pray that God would open a door so I could sneak out, like get away from here. That one makes sense. No, he's like, no, I'm not trying to escape. I'm not trying to get out. Pray that God would open a door for our message, because I'm around these guards and I'm around soldiers that I'm chained to, and there are people around me all the time. In fact, Luke, as he ends his story of Acts with Paul in Rome under house arrest, he tells us that people from Rome were coming to visit him at this house, including many of the Jewish leaders of the synagogues in Jerusalem, visiting him regularly. And he's like, pray for open doors, pray for open doors. And here's why this makes sense to me, because here's something we all know. We all know that there are times when we are open, and there are times when we are not. There are times when we're not, and when we're not open, when we're not open to learning what we need to learn, or seeing what we need to see, or being confronted with what we need to be confronted with, when we're not open, it really doesn't matter how it's presented, does it? Because we don't want to hear it. And Paul says, pray for openness. Pray for openness. That's a spiritual thing. That's a spiritual thing. There are things I can do, and I must do them. There are things I can do. I can seize the moment. I can watch for the opportunities. I can try to explain the story, and I can try as best as I can to be clear, to explain it clearly. In fact, this is a lot of what we've been tapping into throughout this series. How to be clear or clearer about it. We talked about things like beginning where people are at, starting with where they're at, not where we think they should be, entering very genuinely in their story, asking questions, getting to know them and their story, using their language and even their worldview, meeting them where they're at, right, in their story, in their worldview. In fact, even in this little segment right here, it's interesting, this term he uses that I may explain the mystery of Christ. That word mystery is actually a word directly out of their religious world. And he's using it because they would connect with that word. He's using their language. We talked about ditching the religious jargon, right? Including, I think, some of the language that a lot of people feel like the word itself, not just the idea, is necessary and essential if you're going to talk about God and faith to somebody else. And we've been showing throughout this document known as Acts that the first followers, when they're talking to people who don't have that lingo, when they're talking to people who don't have that shared language or those shared ideas, they don't use it. They don't go there. They use their words and their language. In fact, I'll just give you one example. This might hit you in different ways. I can't predict that. But never once in the entire story did anyone ever use hell, the threat of going to hell or the fear of going to hell, as a way to set up the good news or as a point ever in the good news. There are ways that the story gets told that were not a part of the story for them, and not part of the way that they talked about how to connect people with God and faith. And so this idea is increasingly essential, I think, in our increasingly post-Christian world. But here's what Paul is saying. There are things that I can do and I must do them. I'm not praying that God will do for me what I must do, but there are things that we cannot do. And we must pray. And here's what Paul believes. God opens doors through prayer that we cannot open. He opens doors through prayer that we can't open. That open door, that open heart, that open mind, that's a God thing. Can you pray for that? Can you be praying for that? And you get a sense as you're reading this document that this is exactly how Paul's praying. This prayer is how he's praying when he's in chains, and what it means when he talks about praying constantly and watchfully and diligently and gratefully. And so as we end the series, as we wrap up this series this weekend, we want to lean into this whole idea in a practical way. And so Scott was mentioning to you these pamphlets that we have all around. You had to move it out of the way to sit down, so that was annoying. But if you would do me a favor, pick this up and just hold it in your hands for a second, because this is all about, hey, here's some things that are coming up. It's a layout of the Christmas season, which we were saying, hey, it's one of the all-time big, great invitation opportunities of the year, and that's fantastic. But here's the deal. I know this about you, and I know it about me. You've got people in your orbit, people who care about, live near, maybe work with, are related to, that you would love to see connecting with God and with that good news. You'd love to see their lives being kind of impacted by who God is and the richness of that. You would love to see that, and just maybe you'd love to see them connecting really now, this Christmas. And so during this series, we've been talking about a lot of things we can do. A lot of things we can do and must do, a lot of things we can learn and must learn, but a big, big part of this is spiritual. It's the part we cannot do in the other person's life that really, really only God can do. And so we must pray. And that's why I think this back panel of this is the most important piece of the entire brochure. And it says here, my 5 friends. And so what we're about to do, and I'll set this up, and then I'm going to give you a second to do something. We're about to pause for a moment, and we're going to play a little bit of music. And I want you to grab that pen that you had to move out of the way with this. And I want you to spend a minute just thinking, maybe even prayerfully, about who you might write on this sheet of paper. Some names that you might write where you go, I want to just start praying for these people, praying for an open door, praying for openness, praying for whatever God's going to do in their life, praying that God would be good to them. And I want you to take a moment and write down 5 names of people that you would love to see connecting with God. So we're going to play with a little music, and I'm going to give you a chance to actually do that right now before we move on. And then we're going to do something with that a little bit later in the service. So grab that pen and take a moment and start working on that. So there are things we can do, and we must do them because they're ours to do. And then there are things that we can't do. We can't change, we can't control, and we must pray. And so Paul begins his final words of this letter, challenging us to lean into that and lean into it wholeheartedly to pray. And then he hones in on the part that we actually can do. And here's what he says next after challenging them to pray. And he says, and live, I love this, live a life of wisdom around those people. Literally, it is walk around in wisdom. Like walk around through your day in wisdom in front of other people. Live wisely, be known for that, be known for your wisdom so that when people who don't believe what you believe and don't see life the way you see it, when they see your life and the way you live your life, what they see is a really well-lived life. A really well-lived life, a life that's actually working. That works. In fact, that's the idea behind this concept of wisdom. Throughout this letter to the Colossians, Paul has been talking about wisdom and what wisdom is and what wisdom definitely is not. And as he's doing so, he's tapping into this rich tradition, not only of Greco-Roman wisdom, but especially of the wisdom of his own Judaism or Jewish traditions of his day. And in his world, in the Jewish tradition, wisdom was really kind of this idea of how reality is put together, how God put reality together to work, how life works, if you will, and how life works well. And wisdom is this idea of living in such a way that your life is actually really functional. Like you are a well-functioning, well-put-together type of person. I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase. You ever familiar with the phrase, how's that working for you? You ever hear that phrase? How's that working for you? So how's that working for you? Usually said as a snarky way of responding to someone who's doing something you think is not really going to work. Right? It's not working now, or it's not gonna work out. And so it's like your friend's telling you, yeah, last month, I decided to go on this strict donut-only diet. So for the last 30 days, I have eaten nothing but donuts. To which you might respond, wow, how's that going for you? How's that working for you, right? How's that working? And wisdom is all about living life in such a way that it's working for us. Like it really works, and every facet of life is covered by this. Our jobs and our families, our parenting, our marriages if we're married, or our dating life if we're dating, or money, our sexuality, relationships, friendships, business, decision-making, the way we navigate and make choices, conflict resolution, huge, integrity, spirituality. Like every facet of my life is in sync with this idea of the larger principles of life, the way God has put life together to work well, the way things work in such a way that it results in real thriving. A life that's really thriving, a person who's like emotionally and physically and mentally and relationally and spiritually healthy and whole. And part of what Paul is saying, especially as you read the entire letter before you get to the way he wraps it up, that when we're truly following Jesus, it'll make your life better. It'll make your life better, and it'll make you better at life, every facet of your life, and you will become a wiser person. And so here as he ends the letter, he's saying, be known for that. Be a person who's known for your wisdom. When people look at the way you live your life, they go, I don't know what you believe, but like you got it together somehow, like in so many areas of your life. It kind of works. Be known for that by your neighbors, by your coworkers, by your family, by your friends. Be known for your wisdom. Be known for your wisdom. Now, part of that, of living wisely around other people, is how we use our time, using time wisely and well. So he adds this line, making the most of every moment or every season or every opportunity. But literally, the phrase is redeeming the time. Redeeming the time. And that word redeeming having this idea of rescuing something from loss. Rescuing something from loss. And isn't it true, like the older we get, and if you're like getting like a little bit up there, the older we get, the more we wish we could go back and redo some things? Isn't it true, the older we get, the more we wish we could go back and maybe reuse some of that time that we misspent walking down paths that we really wish we had not walked down, that were a waste of our time, or worse than a waste of our time. And maybe as you look back over your journey, there's some sense of regret over some seasons of your life, some days, some weekends, some months, maybe some whole years when you were not walking around in wisdom. You were not you were not making the best choices, and now you wish you could just go back and redo that, respend some of those days or some of those years. And Paul is saying, when you chew on it, a really amazing thing, that there are things that we can do now with our time. There are things that we can do now. There are ways of living wisely with others now. And there are things that God can do when we are, even with those regrets, that will redeem them somehow. Not to redeem them, not in the sense of you need to make up for some things, like there's things you need to make up for, like you need to make up for anything at all. It's not that. It's actually better than that. Redemption is a much more beautiful picture than you trying to make up for something that didn't go well. It's God doing something beautiful and noble and true and good with parts of our story that were just so broken and disappointing or maybe even shameful. And part of living wisely in front of others and part of just living life smartly and well is this idea of making the most of our time, of our moments, and living moments really well, living them redemptively, living redemptive moments. And of course, in order to do that, it really helps to be praying. It really helps to be praying and praying constantly and praying watchfully, because I'll just say, way too often, I find myself realizing there might have been a moment a number of moments later. Like when the moment's already gone. You ever have that happen? Like, oh, I could have, or I wish I would have thought about maybe offering to do something. There was a moment I had there and I wasn't even paying attention. If I had been head on a swivel, fully alert, watchful in moment by moment contact with God. Is there anything you want me to say right now? Anything you want me to be aware of? Anything you want me to be doing? Anything you want me to sing? I would have caught that moment and I would have been able to make the most of that. I would have been able to redeem that time. Living wisely, walking around every day in wisdom, making the most of time, making most of opportunities. And then he adds a second idea, a related idea, your conversation or your words being always, I love this, full of grace. Your conversation, your words, and the context, of course, is the conversation or the words that when other people are seeing you, what they experience of you, when people are watching or listening. Of course, I think this is a really good rule of thumb for personal, private conversations that other people might not see as well. But this is part of living a life of wisdom in front of others, that the people who experience you experience your conversation as being, I love this, full of, say this word out loud with me, grace. Full of grace, full of not what we might think Paul would say Christians should be full of in their speech, like you should be full of moral rectitude and righteousness, or your words should be full of political correctness and accuracy or theological truth. Not that there's anything wrong with any of those things, but when Paul chooses a single idea to define what other people should experience from a conversation with us, whether we're having that conversation with them or they're just overhearing that conversation, when he chooses a single idea, he chooses this word right here, grace. grace, wisdom, reasonableness, a generosity of spirit that just comes oozing out of you, a sense of acceptance with them, not because you lack any boundaries or don't have any sense of right and good, healthy, what's true and noble and beautiful and pure and things like that, not because you lack that, but because in the context of that, what you exude is just grace. And Jesus, by the way, was brilliant at this. He was so brilliant at this that one of his best friends, think about this, one of the people who knew him best in this world, when he decided to describe Jesus with a single phrase, called him full of grace and truth. Full of grace and truth. Let your conversation be full of grace. Full of grace, full of that reasonableness and generosity of spirit and sense of acceptance. And then he adds this line that unpacks that phrase and develops it a little bit. Seasoned, he says, with salt. Salt in the ancient world was both a flavor enhancer, which it is now, but also especially a preservative in a world without refrigeration. And when Jesus called his followers, and this is kind of famous, you may have heard this before, salt of the earth, you're the salt of the earth, he clearly implies both of these uses, that we should be people who are adding goodness and flavor, but also preserving the world at the same time. Gracious and salty words. Think about that. Gracious and salty words just kind of picks up that idea. In other words, the way that we talk about our faith, the way that we talk about life and God and our own journey is the whole way we do it is gracious and winsome. Here's Paul's big idea. Wise living and gracious speech attract people to the way of Jesus. Wise living and gracious speech attract people to the way of Jesus, which raises a question before we wind down. The question is this: is that what people experience from you? I mean, give yourself a little self-assessment. Do people experience these two things coming out of your life? Especially, think about this, especially when dealing with the messy cultural issues of our day. Do they experience from you a wise life and a really gracious way about it? And if not, then perhaps you have a growth opportunity for you. Because for Paul, this is what followers of Jesus do in the world, that people experience from us a way of wisdom and gracious, salty speech. Let your conversation always be full of grace. Let it be seasoned with salt, he says, so that you may know how to answer or respond to everyone else. And the assumption in this last line is that I'm skilled enough in really listening and paying attention to everyone else that I can actually hear and understand exactly what they might be asking or wondering about so that I can respond to it in a gracious and clear and winsome way, which brings us all the way back to where we began, praying. And praying diligently, and man, praying all the time. Just constant conversational relationship with God, head on a swivel, watching, paying attention, listening, having this conversational relationship with God, often while I'm having the conversation or interaction with the other person of, okay, God, what should I be seeing here? Are you doing something? Can you open a door? Have you already opened a door? Where are you working in this person's life? How can I see that? What do you want me to see? What do you want me to notice? What do you want me to do? How can I respond to this person in the most helpful way for where they're at right now? And I'm carrying on that conversation as I'm just, again, head on a swivel, alert, thinking about where they're at and how I can engage them where they're at. So we're going to take a moment and kind of lean into this right now. And we're going to take a moment after you've written down some of those names, which I asked you to do a minute ago, to pray. So again, there's going to be some music playing. And now after you've written these names down, I want you to look at these names and I want you to take just some time to pray for them. In fact, maybe there's a few more names and you'll think of a few more and write them down. And so once again, there's going to be some music playing softly. And with the Christmas season coming up, pray for open doors. Pray for an openness. Pray for what God might be doing in that person's life that you can't even see. Pray for them. Pray for redemptive moments. Pray for redemptive opportunities. Pray for your ability to love them really wisely and generously, to live wisely in front of them, to be alert, to ask good questions, to be sensitive and aware of their story, and pray that God would do the part that you cannot do. Take a few moments and pray, and then I'm going to give us a minute to do that, and then Christian's actually going to come up and join me, and we're going to lead you in an exercise about what to do with that after we take some time to pray. So take a couple minutes and let's pray for these people that we've written down. Well, hey, thanks again so much for being here with us as we're wrapping up this series. As you're walking out, Scott mentioned to these Connect cards, love to hear from you, love to get to know you, and all of your prayer requests. Like feel free, write them all down. There's no shame. So throw these in the offering baskets on your way out. Our guest services will be there. Of course, you can throw the offering envelopes in those baskets as well. And if you're part of the Terra Nova family, just so appreciate your gratitude, your generosity. And of course, many of you give online and on the app. And so you can do that. But then take this brochure with you that has those names. Where did I just stick mine? Anyway, it doesn't matter. You know what it looks like. So take that with you and stick that somewhere where you're going to see it and you're going to remember, and just be thinking about the things that we have coming up and ways that you might invite people to just come along and be a part of it. And especially as a reminder to pray and to continuously pray for those people in your life and for open doors and for opportunities. And then, of course, man, I hope you have the best Thanksgiving, an incredibly grateful week. And I hope you'll join us next weekend as we cap off this Thanksgiving weekend with a really, really special weekend, a worship weekend. And then the following weekend, we jump into our new series. So God bless you guys. Happy Thanksgiving. Have a wonderful week. And we'll see you back next weekend for our worship weekend.